March 1866, Windsor, Vermont, and Cornish, New Hampshire. The Connecticut River is in spring violence, swollen by thaw and rain, crowded with broken ice, moving with the dark force of a thing that does not negotiate. Then the river takes the bridge. The third crossing at this site, itself a replacement for earlier spans already lost to flood, is lifted and broken by a freshet and an ice jam, and sent downriver as wreckage, and almost immediately, in the same year, people decide they will build again. A timber bridge, nearly 500 feet long, with no steel skeleton to save them, a bridge that would have to stand where 3 others had failed. That is the part that sounds unreasonable now. The river had already delivered its answer. It had said what it did to timber, to piers, to anything built too low, too light, too trusting. It had said that the crossing between these 2 towns could be erased in a single night of moving water and ice, and yet the crossing was too important to abandon. The question was no longer whether the Connecticut was dangerous. Everybody knew that. The question was how, in a country still building itself out of forest and quarry and hand labor, people could force a long bridge over a river that had just torn the last one away. To understand that decision, you have to forget the covered bridge as a postcard object. Forget autumn leaves, white church steeples, honeymoon sentiment. In the 19th century, a bridge like this was not nostalgia, it was infrastructure in the hardest sense of the word. It was a machine for moving life across a barrier. Roads converged on it, farm wagons depended on it, drovers pushed animals over it. Trade depended on it. A ferry could be delayed by weather or ice. A detour could steal hours from a journey and money from a season's work. A permanent bridge changed the map of daily existence. It made 2 banks into one working region. The upper Connecticut Valley was agricultural country, but not quiet country. It was a landscape of mills, roads, river landings, and market movement. Toll records from the earlier bridge show what this crossing carried in the 1820s. Thousands of sheep, thousands of cattle, seasonal waves of livestock moving through the valley in dense autumn surges. On peak days, the crossing saw near torrents of animals, hooves striking planks where water once stood between communities. That traffic tells you what the bridge meant. This was not ornament, it was an artery. Remove it, and movement slows, costs rise, and the river becomes once again what it had always been before engineering intervened, a division. And so, after the 1866 destruction, the work began again, with a kind of grim clarity. 1 month after the flood, a contract was signed. The builders were James F. Tasker of Cornish and Bela J. Fletcher of nearby Claremont, experienced timber bridge contractors in a region where wood was still the great structural material. This was before structural steel would dominate American bridges, before the modern habit of solving span and load with rolled metal members and massive industrial fabrication. Here the available world was different. Forest first, stone second, iron only as a helper. If a nearly 500-foot bridge was going to stand here, it would stand on spruce, granite, bolts, tools, and judgment. The design they chose came out of one of the great American answers to material scarcity and practical necessity, the Town Lattice Truss. Patented by Ithiel Town in 1820, it was brilliant, partly because it was not aristocratic engineering. It did not demand heroic carved joinery on every member or a workforce of rare specialists. It turned strength into pattern. Diagonals crossed diagonals, making a web of overlapping triangles that spread load through repetition rather than through a few massive elements. In its classic form, the system used comparatively small pieces of lumber and could be assembled by local carpenters and laborers with modest skill. That mattered in a young country. It meant bridges could be built fast, from available timber, by communities that needed crossings more than they needed elegance. But the Cornish-Windsor crossing could not be an ordinary town truss. It was too long, too exposed, too tested already by the river beneath it. So Tasker and Fletcher strengthened the formula. Instead of the lighter planks more typical of town lattice work, they used heavier 6 by 8 inch spruce timbers. They notched them where they met. They fastened them with iron bolts rather than relying only on wooden pins. The trusses were arranged on either side of the roadway, with multiple upper and lower chords, lateral bracing above and below, and a roof stretched over the whole structure to protect the working timber from weather. No steel truss, no steel beam, but not primitive either. This was refined timber engineering, adapted under pressure, with just enough iron to bind and anchor the wooden body of the bridge. And if these stories of labor and design matter to you, subscribe, because the modern world still hides its makers inside structures that seem, at first glance, to have simply appeared. The bridge was framed first in a meadow in Windsor, northwest of the site. That detail matters because it reveals the intelligence of the build. You do not shape and fit every major piece while standing over a live river if you can help it. You lay out members on land, you measure, you bore, you align, you correct mistakes before the structure is committed to the crossing. Somewhere in that field, in the months after the flood, spruce timbers were set down in ordered lines over grass and earth. Holes were bored through green wood. Iron bolts were driven home. The diagonal lattice took form piece by piece, not yet a bridge, only a logic of intersecting members spread under the open sky. Then came the labor that records usually shrink into a phrase. Construction took about 7 months. 7 months sounds neat until you unpack it into bodies. Stone had to be set and trusted. The west abutment and the central pier were massive masonry, built to bear not only the dead weight of the bridge, but the live force of wagons, animals, and later vehicles, while also resisting current, ice, and debris. The central pier's upstream nose was rounded and flared toward the riverbed, so floating ice and timber would strike and slide rather than hit squarely. That shape was not decoration, it was a lesson learned from impact. Somewhere below the level of official history, masons handled heavy blocks, set mortar, checked line, and worked close to cold water, whose mood they had every reason to respect. Then the carpenters took over again. Think of the feel of that work: wet timbers, iron chilled by spring mornings, augers grinding through spruce, mallets striking, adzes correcting a stubborn edge, men on temporary staging and false work, or on the partly assembled frame itself, moving above a current that had already destroyed the last bridge. The town lattice was famous partly because it reduced the need for highly elaborate joinery, but that did not make it easy. Repetition is its own kind of labor. Intersection after intersection, bolt after bolt, brace after brace. Every member had to matter because the whole design depended on accumulation. A lattice bridge is not saved by one heroic beam. It survives because hundreds of decisions hold, and the workers, almost all unnamed now, carried the true cost in their hands: backs, knees, and balance. Teamsters hauled the timbers, laborers shifted members with ropes, levers, and animal power. Carpenters climbed and lifted and trusted their footing above open water. Someone steadied a timber while another drove the fastening. Someone worked through rain because the season was moving and the crossing had to reopen. Someone went home soaked in river wind, with pitch on his hands and wood fibers in his clothes. That is the emotional truth of old infrastructure. The structure remains, but the bodies that made it disappear first. There is one especially revealing detail about James Tasker. He was remembered as an intuitive engineer who reportedly could neither read nor write. Whether that memory has been sharpened by retelling or not, it captures something essential about the era. American bridge building in the 19th century still belonged, in large measure, to men who knew force through material, not just through paper calculation. They knew timber by sound, by weight, by grain, by the way a member carried itself when lifted. They knew rivers by season. They knew what a pier had to deflect, what a cord had to endure, what a roof could save from rot. It was knowledge with splinters in it. Practical, embodied, and often absent from the formal record, The roof itself deserves a second look. People like to assume covered bridges were covered for charm or for snow. In truth, the roof was a structural and economic decision. Moisture kills wood. An uncovered timber bridge can decay with brutal speed. Cover the deck and the trusses, keep sun and rain off the critical members, and the lifespan changes dramatically. The covering also stiffens the structure. It turns the bridge from an exposed frame into something closer to a protected timber vessel stretched across land and water. The Cornish-Windsor Bridge was built to work, and the roof was part of that work. What they completed by late October or early November of 1866 was immense by the standards of timber bridge building in America. At floor level, the bridge ran a little over 450 feet, and along the ridge, longer still. Each clear span reached beyond 200 feet. That mattered. In wood, every added foot multiplies doubt. Timber sags, joints work, vibration travels, floods return. And yet the completed bridge did what great public works always do when they succeed. It made a difficulty feel ordinary. Animals crossed it. Wagons crossed it. Travelers crossed it and, after the first moment of awe, simply incorporated it into life. The impossible feat became the road. It remained a toll bridge for generations. That too is part of the story. Bridges were not only engineering works, they were financial instruments, owned, maintained, and justified through traffic. The crossing had to pay its way, and because it paid its way, it bound the two towns together more tightly over time. This was a working border between New Hampshire and Vermont, but a bridge like this softened the meaning of that border. Commerce crossed it. Local habit crossed it. Communities grew around the confidence that the river could be traversed at this exact place. The remarkable thing is not simply that the bridge stood in 1866, it is that it kept standing. Floods came again. Ice came again. The 20th century arrived with heavier traffic, changing standards, and a national impatience with old wooden infrastructure. Many covered bridges were burned, washed away, bypassed, or replaced. Vermont alone lost staggering numbers of them in the flood of 1927. Cornish-Windsor survived. New Hampshire bought it in the 1930s. Tolls were finally removed in 1943. Repairs came, then major rehabilitation, then more repair. By the late 20th century, engineers had to preserve it, with techniques its builders could never have named. But still, the goal was not to erase the old bridge. It was to keep its form, its crossing, its timber logic alive. That survival can make the bridge seem inevitable, as if it was always destined to become the longest wooden-covered bridge in the United States, the last word in a disappearing craft. It was not inevitable. It was contingent. It survived because 19th-century builders adjusted the design after repeated disaster, because later generations decided it was worth saving, and because the original work had enough honesty in it to endure reinforcement instead of demanding replacement. The bridge did not defeat the river once and for all. Nothing defeats a river once and for all. It merely met it, season after season, with enough intelligence to remain. And if you have crossed a bridge like this, or live near one, tell me in the comments. Not because these structures are quaint, but because they are local memory made physical, the kind you can still drive across. Today, when a car passes through the Cornish-Windsor covered bridge, the traveler enters a chamber of timber and filtered light. The river is still there below, still cold, still capable of violence. The diagonal lattice still carries load outward and downward. The old geometry still works. Most people who cross it now do not need it in the desperate way the 19th century needed it. There are other roads, other bridges, other routes, but that is precisely why it can be misunderstood. Seen only as charm, it becomes small. Seen properly, it becomes immense, a nearly 500-foot answer to geography, weather, commerce, and repeated failure, raised not by steel empires, but by regional builders and anonymous workers using forest-grown material, stone, iron, patience, and nerve.